Get started in about 15 seconds here, but yeah. Anybody got any exciting plans for forest and outdoor recreation enjoyment for fall break?
We're going camping.
Camping?
Yeah, it's my birthday, and so we're just gonna like hike all day and then camp that night.
Outstanding. Or if by camping you mean sleeping, out sleeping.
Yeah.
Forestry joke. All right. Cool. Anybody else? You can, for whatever forest and outdoor recreation stuff you do, as a reminder, turn in kind of a trip write-up and relate to it any of the concepts we've been talking about in class so far, and that counts as a quiz for extra credit. So, good excuse to get out there and hike and camp and everything else. All right, let's jump back into it with our history of forest and outdoor recreation, how we think about, or how we have thought in the past as humans about leisure and forest resource use and the best and highest application of the human species. Cool, so we left off on Tuesday talking about this Aristotle guy, or Aristotelian philosophy. And Aristotle wrote a bunch of stuff. He was extremely influential and helped kind of spur a bunch of other, he and Plato helped spur a bunch of other schools of philosophical thought. So we're going to spend kind of the first half of the class talking through a few of these other senses of how things work. And again, we can kind of slow down and zoom in on this section of history a little bit more because this is post-invention of writing. We have much more detailed records of how people thought about things like forest resources and so forth. And we can kind of explore that and kind of compare and contrast against what we think about these things today. So, all these different schools of thought. We'll be talking about a couple of major world religions today. You don't have to agree or disagree with any of this stuff, but take a moment to reflect as we're going through some of these things. What do I think about this relative to what anybody else in the past has sort of figured out? Right? There's no guarantee that we align at all with what previous generations have figured about any of this stuff. But they're also possibly not 100% completely wrong, right? Western civilization is in very large part and traceably based on what we're going to be talking about today. So a lot of the values, a lot of our systems of law and governance, how we think about how to rule over our natural resources and so forth, right? It got started back around 2,500 years ago, or at least we can pin it with some certainty to 2,500 years ago-ish, because again, we have some pretty decent writings in the form of papyri and scrolls, and later on with the Romans, codices, so collections of books, and so forth. All right, so we've talked about Aristotle. Moving on. The next school of thought in ancient Greek civilization is going to be the Cynics. And cynicism as a term has absolutely morphed in the 2 millennia since this was kind of a big thing. So today, cynicism is kind of a sour take on the world if you're very cynical or sarcastic and jaded and just kind of done with the whole thing, sort of over it, as we might say these days. But back then, cynicism as a school of how to understand reality was very much what we would call empirical, or empiricism, which is a fancy way of saying this is nothing more than all of reality is limited to essentially what we can perceive out of reality. So if there's some mystical empyrean or phlogiston or magic or mana or something else really sort of powering reality, if we can't see it, it kind of doesn't matter, and therefore there's a reasonable chance it just doesn't exist. So you can make up whatever you want to, but if you can't see it, if you can't put your hand on it, then it kind of doesn't figure in. Okay, so empiricism is what can I see with my senses? Empirical work today is what can we measure with our senses? So what can we go out in the forest plot or the forest stand and measure directly by looking at it, or pacing off distances, how many chains or how many paces, or let me co-locate with this GPS point and measure what's there. That's all empirical field work. These days, empirical also means what can we perceive that is also possible to perceive as extended by cybernetics and electronic sensing. So empirical work now also includes things like aerial photography, satellite imaging, hyperspectral stuff. So hyperspectral imagery is things that you can now see with electronic sensors that are out past ultraviolet on the high frequency end of the visible light spectrum, and down below infrared, which is on the low frequency end, the cooler end or the lower energy end of the spectrum, beyond what we can see. So hyperspectral. All right, so cynicism as a term has changed. Empirical as a term has changed and evolved and grown a little bit with the advent of electronics. But back then, again, it was pretty much just, what can I see, what can I touch, what can I sort of verify by looking at it? And this is a very practical or pragmatic or kind of down to earth, we might say grounded these days, sensation of how to understand reality, right? So it was a very practical sense of, okay, so if we like something, we'll tend to pursue that. Pleasureful pursuits, things like eating delicious foods, and to a limited extent, things like fitness, a runner's high, things like seeking comfort and companionship in fellow humans, right? We enjoy the sensations of falling in love, for example. And so these things drive human behavior. We are seeking pleasure and avoiding pain. And if you've ever gone hungry, you know how physically painful starvation is. So the cynics were saying, look, we don't have to complicate our understanding of things much beyond this. We can kind of roll with a very clear and basic sense of human drives. If it feels good, do it. If it doesn't feel good, don't do it. Now, there's some caveats with that, right? We can take anything to a harmful extreme, but this is a very sort of no-nonsense or commonsensical attempt to do things. And so their conclusion out of that sense of seeking pleasure and avoiding pain, driving our behavioral dynamics, as a term we'd use these days, their conclusion was, we can get kind of out of balance with this stuff. And so the cynic approach in ancient Greece was to not go over the cliff and completely forego eating any food that tastes at all good, but don't get into gluttony, right? Don't overeat. Don't trade other things for good tasting food beyond what's really sort of necessary to keep you rolling. Don't punish yourself unnecessarily, but also it's absolutely a waste to do anything beyond that, because you're just going to eat the food and the next day you're going to be hungry again, right? So there's not much point in going too hard on material goods and seeking those pleasures. It's a fleeting thing. They're temporary and they don't sort of move you forward at all. You're just sort of treading water, metaphorically speaking, in that mindset. Okay? Now, some critics of cynicism have said, well, of course, like when you're a very small child, like a toddler, your brain does work on that level. You are seeking rewards and you are trying to avoid punishments, right? So this is the old carrot and stick approach, right? So you dangle something tasty in front of a tiny little kid and you can help potty train them, for example, to not poop all over the floor over time. And this works with a lot of animals, right? So reward good behaviors. Some trainers punish undesirable behaviors, and so on and so forth. An answer to cynicism, or maybe a complement to it, might be the sense of skepticism, which is sort of out of the Greek skepsis. It's the sense of like the cynics, but to another logical elaboration. So with, for example, the cynics, they would say, all right, if you've seen it, then you know it exists because you've seen it. So the skeptics might say something like, okay, well, have you ever had a dream? And you definitely saw things in your dreams, but when you wake up, those things aren't there. So, checkmate, cynics. We're playing 4D chess over here, centuries before chess has been invented, and so forth. So the skeptics say, doubt even your senses, and because we can't trust even our senses, right? So this would be an era of human history where things like what we recently called things like schizophrenia or other psychiatric conditions where you have sensory inputs that are phantom or illusory, right? You hear voices, for example. Prominent atheist Richard Dawkins calls this the God delusion, right? If you can't even trust your senses, just keep it simple. Try to live a peaceable life. Get along. Go along with other folks who are kind of annoying. But go along to get along. And eventually, these folks got folded into another school of thought, Stoicism. Now, if you're at all on YouTube and you've ever seen like, these, they're often AI voice narrated now, and they have a bunch of like AI generated or clip art of like Greek and Roman busts of philosophers and stuff like this. The skeptic and stoic, especially stoic, videos on YouTube are just out of control. Let's talk about what they were actually into instead of modern marketing efforts. The Stoics you could sort of summarize them as acceptance. If you had to boil this entire school of philosophical thought and ontology and epistemology, which is what is the systematization of everything that we can know, what's the whole range of human knowledge, so ontology, and then epistemology is how can we organize our understanding into some kind of a hierarchy or a system. It's called epistemology. And the Stoic epistemology is what will be, right? The seasons are going to come, the seasons are going to go. We need to plant in the spring and harvest in the fall, and just roll with it. Don't worry too much about pleasures and pains. Those seasons will come, they will go. You're going to be young for a while, then you're going to be old, then you're going to be dead, and it's all just going to kind of happen. So accept the good things that are with each season of life. Accept that there are always going to be politicians who philander, and so on and so forth. And kind of align yourself with the natural order of things, the natural cycles and seasons, and so forth. So the understanding of time in ancient Greek and other Mediterranean cultures like the ancient Hebrews, the Egyptians, and so forth, there's absolutely a cyclical understanding of time. We'll talk more about that next week. But a cyclical sense of time is not one of progress. It is, it's winter now, or it's autumn here. So winter is coming, and spring's going to come after that, and then it's going to be fall again eventually. And we'll just sort of, as long as we know where we are on the cycle, and we're well aligned with that, and we're doing what we need to be doing in each season of the year and each season of life, we're going to be okay. So this doesn't put much emphasis on things like adventuring and exploration and long-distance backpacking, stuff like that, right? Most of the world in this area is at least sparsely settled, right? There are a lot of different city-states, and then in Macedonia to the north, which is sort of the rocky and mountainous area that is north of modern-day Greece, and people are periodically sailing across the Mediterranean to invade us. Every once in a while, we're sending over an army to invade them. It's like, that's all well and good, but it'd be kind of nice if we could just farm and do our thing. That's very much a stoic take on life. Pleasure is more trouble than it's worth. Yeah, party as hard as you want, but be ready to pay the price tag the following morning, and the day after that, and the day after that, right? So there's a bigger price tag than the very temporary or ephemeral benefits, because it can knock you off of the natural cycles of nature and life. And then on the other hand, we've got the Epicureans and the hedonists. The Epicureans gave us a contribution to all of this philosophy. There's a sense of the soul, which, if you're an empirical person, a cynic or a skeptic, right? It's hard to put your eyeballs onto a soul, and so it doesn't really fit into those worldviews. But the Epicureans, led by Epicurus, said that, yeah, we absolutely do have souls. And those souls are kind of the point, because our bodies are temporary. It's like our physical bodies, from all of the ailments that we don't understand because we don't have a germ theory of illness yet until around the year 1900. Okay, thousands of years after these guys are kicking around. Like, life is temporary. Pleasure is temporary. Pain is temporary. You're gonna die, and you're gonna be dead for a lot longer than you are alive. So, where do you go? What happens? What part of you goes when you die? And that is the soul. And so Epicurus and so forth and his adherents thought that the soul is eternal, and it is free from judgment, and so forth. And therefore, you're going to die someday, so there's nothing holding you back from getting into leisure. Living simply, right? Living simply is kind of a theme across several of these groups. Whether or not you believe in a soul, whether or not you believe in a linear or progress-oriented sense of time, living simply is a common thread, even though the philosophies pushing towards that conclusion are wildly different, right? Some folks are saying, got a soul, big deal. Live simply, therefore. Other folks are like, I don't see your soul, so you must not have a soul. Live simply, therefore. And so forth. Okay? So the Epicureans, and these days the term Epicurean has evolved a little bit as well. We'll talk about that in a sec. The Epicureans kind of sorted leisure into, because we are free to think about more lofty things, they put a little bit more thought into organizing, categorizing how to think about leisure. They had this sense of sort of the joy of using your brain or using your mind. A lot of ancient cultures didn't think that the brain as a physical electrical organ was the seat of consciousness. A lot of them thought it was the heart or the spleen, the stomach, depending on which culture you were in. But Epicurus was like, there is something higher. We are a little bit more ascended than the animals. We are different, and it is not just possible for us to think and reason and come up with schools of philosophy, but indeed, that is a good thing. That is a pleasure-inducing thing, to figure things out. It's very satisfying. Interesting take on leisure. Bunch of nerds sitting around going, I think, therefore... No, that was a different philosopher much later, but, right? That's kind of the vibe going on here, right? Hey guys, we have minds, let's use them. Oh, doesn't that feel good to have kind of a brain-gasm? Man, I just figured something out. Oh, that feels so good, right? Is kind of the sense of philosophical leisure. And then, of course, that's a superset on top of what everybody else is also kind of saying. Pay a lot of attention to the cycles of nature. Pay attention to our relationship with the gods as we understand them, the Greek pantheon and so forth, right? So the lightning god versus the god or the demigods who bring us things like fire and so forth. Okay? These days, the term Epicurean has a big focus. What this means to us today is an Epicurean lifestyle is one where you're focused on good food and travel to beautiful places and a life free from the toils of labor. So it's not really a working class outlook. It's like if you're an Instagram influencer and you want to rent a house for a couple of days to make a bunch of videos for the clout. You head to some Caribbean island, do those things. What you're showing on camera for those, 60-second reels or whatever, is very much an emphasis on, in a lot of these videos, the Epicurean life, right? So sponsors send you free food and fancy clothes and stuff like that. It's what some folks would call the good life, and what other folks would call just a ridiculous overemphasis on materialism, a very shallow existence. Just depends on your school of thought. And then we got the hedonists. All right, so these days, a hedonist might be a broad label applied to somebody who enjoys nude bathing or stuff like that. Or it's very much the emphasis on pleasure. So where other schools of thought are saying things like going out for a hike in the hills outside of your farm or your estate or whatever, keep it pretty close to home, right? Simple pleasures. Whereas the hedonists are like, nah, dog, I love that for you, but I'm gonna go as hard as I can on all of this stuff. Let's partay, because life is short, and so forth. And interestingly, the hedonists are one of relatively few groups or folks among a school of thought that entrain power and wealth into a positive sense of the world. Right? So a Stoic, for example, is going to look at the pursuit of power as generally a bad thing in a lot of respects. Certainly master yourself, understand your own strengths and vulnerabilities, and that is your power as an individual. But the hedonists, man, we can party harder if we're really rich. We can pay other people to do all the worky stuff, and we'll just get blasted on Scissor and Lean and so on and so forth. I don't know what the kids are mixing out of cough syrup these days, but interestingly, a very progressive emperor or conqueror, Cyrus of Persia. So the Persians were contemporary in this time. The Medo-Persian Empire took over chunks of what is now Greece and most of the Eastern Mediterranean and did all kinds of stuff. Conquered what is now the nation state of Israel and enslaved a bunch of people and then sent a bunch of those folks back so they could build their own temples. So if you grew up in church, for example, this is that Cyrus. Interesting stuff. And his court was pretty turned up, we might say these days. Like this is the place to be. And his sense of accumulating power was to use power in a relatively soft way. That is, I want to conquer all kinds of places all around me. We have military technology that is far beyond what others have at that time in ancient history. And those folks are going to pay us a tribute every year, and they're going to send their best and brightest. We're going to take the smartest and healthiest and strongest, most athletic people out of all of these tributary nations, and I'm going to concentrate them in my capital city, essentially to, among other things, hold them as ransom. Like, if you take a conquered king's kids and say, they're my kids now, and if you mess around, I'm going to cut their throats and send you their heads. That is a way to exercise power and control over tributary nations. And so what that does is, as a flex, as a power move, as a boss move, just like how the ancient Mesopotamians and the Babylonians were doing stuff like setting up hanging gardens on their ziggurats or their big step temples, as a flex, as a public display of look how good we are making it because the gods are aligned with us and we're going to rule things so that power and wealth and leisure flow to us. So this works. We see this pattern repeated, copy-pasted over and over as one nation conquers another. So there goes on an up arc and then a down arc as the next one's coming up and taking over the old one, and so forth, right? So there's the Persians, the Assyrians, ancient Israel, like all of these are around here, and they're all sort of conquering each other one after the other. The Egyptians are all throughout this time, up into this time as well. And then Egypt gets split into the northern and southern kingdoms, and then Alexander the Great, the Macedonian guy, in his early to mid 20s, conquered from like Italy all the way over to India, literally, and then he died young, and that entire empire gets split across his generals called the Ptolemies, and there's just a lot of warfare and conquering, and everybody's saying, okay, so those idiots that we just slaughtered, they didn't know how to do reality. We know how to do reality. So if you are aligned with us, it's going to be a big party in our capital because all of the places that we've conquered are flowing resources to us in these places. Sound good? All right. So now hedonism is just disregarding, or it's used to describe someone who generally disregards most other aspects of life to just focus on sensuality. So if you know somebody who spends most all of their time sort of glassy-eyed and red-eyed and just, kind of fried on edibles or bong or vape or lots and lots and lots of mushrooms or LSD or meth or anything like that, where you're just trying to, in this case, use either pharmacology, so chemicals derived from plants, or chemicals derived from a synthetic chemistry lab like methamphetamine, right? It's hijacking the brain's natural wiring to crank up the sensuality, the sensual inputs of, in most cases, like dopamine, for example. So cocaine, sex, and hugs all work on the same chemical pathway in your brain. But cocaine cranks it not up to 11, but like 11,000, right? To the point that it will physically change the structure and pathways of your brain's operation and hijack other behaviors, right? We all know what the stereotype of a methamphetamine addict can look or behave like. Okay, so that's how hedonism is used today. But this is back in its original sense, right? The hedonists were just trying to figure out, how do we be? We're in a culture now here in the Mediterranean where the climate is garden-like enough, it's mild enough, the Mediterranean climate where it's sunny with a high of 75 most all of the year. And our fields are productive enough with our basically primitive farming techniques. And we're not getting slaughtered every year in warfare, a lot of years, but not every year, during the summer. So how do we want to live? How do we want to use those excess calories? All of these different Greek philosophical schools of thought were formal attempts to try and explain the world. Explain, well, if we're pretty likely to die before age 5 and very likely to die before about age 45, well, how do we want to go in those short decades? Right? Pretty interesting stuff. Anyway, we'll see sort of threads or hints of all of these in stuff like the laws of the United States that we'll talk about a little bit later in the modern history of America section of our history discussion. All right, so keep these in mind. And we'll end up today on this slide here. So we want to talk about the shift of cultures from the Greeks that we've just been talking about, right? All these philosophies in a place. And then the Roman military empire, the Roman, later on the Republic, which used continuing advancements in metallurgy to make better weapons, and enormous advancements in logistics with things like Roman roads to move legions and move the supplies needed for those legions to continually conquer a little bit more. And one of their earliest conquests is, of course, Greek culture. They basically, because the Romans are kind of busy with buildings and rooms and buildings called vomitoria, where some historians strongly suggest that like a typical Friday night equivalent for them would be, hey, let's party and eat and drink as hard as we can, and then let's go boot and rally, so let's go puke all that up, and then let's go party for round two, right? The old boot and rally. So the Romans are so busy with this and conquering everybody else around them that we could sort of mischaracterize them as too busy to kind of come up with their own sort of meaningful religion. So they just copy paste the Greeks and rename everything, right? Like completely. And Greeks and Romans both had a category for driving society, especially at the agricultural productivity level, using slaves or enslaved humans. Different historians, depending on who you read, will suggest that for a lot of these enslaved peoples, that slavery was pretty brutal, and others will suggest that it was more like, if you've heard the term indentured servitude, where it's more like you sign on or acquire a debt, and the person is like your full-time, day in, day out boss for a period of up to years. But you can work off that debt, and then you are a free person once again. In practice, it was probably little column A, little column B. But we definitely have a much stronger stratification or layering of society under the Romans, who are taking the Greek way of life and, again, sort of turbocharging that with military logistics and conquest, and continually expanding the size of the Roman Empire until the Romans are marching legions all the way out to places like Scotland, right? So this is more than just the Mediterranean basin, like the Greeks were sort of, sailing triremes and stuff like that around like the coast of the Mediterranean. The Romans go extra hard, down into Saharan Africa, as far east as they were trying to do. They built a whole string of military forts, bases, logistics sites through what are modern-day Iraq and Afghanistan. Some of those lines of forts were just found from space, actually, a couple years ago. Very cool stuff. So the Romans, if you want to think of them as like the Greeks, but on like human growth hormone and with like roid rage, they're constantly expanding this empire until it gets so big there's too much perimeter. In forestry habitat management, we'd say the edge to interior ratio of the Roman Empire was too much edge. And so Germanic clans broke the back of the legions up there. If you saw the movie Gladiator when you were a kid, the opening scenes are a battle of a Roman legion against Germanic tribes. And they made it, again, as far as places like Scotland before they had to start coming back because the Roman Empire is starting to collapse under its own weight. So all this leads to the stratification of society. The Romans are so busy war fighting on like dozens of fronts all the time that they have to sort of give over running of the day-to-day ops of all of these farms to support all this, because food spoilage is a thing, so you got to produce a lot more food than you will actually need. And then citizens who had, in particular folks who had given military service, were given fairly generous, at least at first, military benefits packages, right? So go fight in a couple of campaigns way off in the ass end of nowhere from the perspective of Rome up in Germany, or modern day Germany, and then come back, retire, and if you still have all your fingers and toes, you can enjoy your villa. So this was the Romans' approach to giving everybody who fought and served and helped expand the empire, kind of like the 40 acres and a mule, but also a house and a whole bunch of slaves to run the place, and the farm animals that you needed to, and help you get your vineyard all established and planted, because everybody's got to roll pretty thick with a vineyard, right? So this is a stronger stratification of, or layering of society on this two-tier model. And eventually the Roman Empire got so big it just kind of ate itself alive. So if you're a Shakespeare fan and you know anything about Julius Caesar, for example, or Hannibal, not Hannibal the cannibal of recent pop culture, but like Hannibal of Carthage, literally marching war elephants on Rome, like that's metal as hell. Like this is what people did back in the day. Anyway, the senators, the generals, they start infighting, and the Roman Empire splits basically in half. There's an Eastern Roman Empire and a Western Roman Empire, and they get along a little bit for a little while into like the 200s, the 300s, into the 400s, and then the collapse of the Roman Empire really starts in earnest as the Visigoths, for example, march into Rome and sack it, raping the horses, riding off on the women kind of stuff. That's a bad joke, sorry. Anyway, and by that point, Roman culture and technological innovations like message running via relays of horses, later modeled in things like the American Pony Express, like 1,500 years later, it's the same idea in the same way across the United States instead of across the Roman Empire. Their way of thinking was a big cultural export, right? So they standardized, they liked to make everybody sort of work like they did in a lot of ways, okay? And so their sense of wealth, their sense of leisure evolves from a more or less neutral sense of the Greeks on, money's fine, like you need it to buy food, for example, unless you're the farmer, in which case you needed to buy updated farm implements and stuff like that. But for most of those Greek schools of thought, we didn't even really mention accumulation of wealth as like a primary driving force. The Roman sense of it was, again, this pastoral retirement. We don't really have a middle class. We have a slave class and we have a citizen class. We don't have a blue-collar working class. You're either a slave or a veteran, basically, or family of. And then something happens in the last 4 centuries of the Roman Empire, which was a big and long-lived empire as far as these things go. We have one of the conquered states of the Romans, so ancient Israel, ruled over by governors and with legionnaires, essentially as a peacekeeping force, and not particularly a lot of agreement between Jewish and Roman ways of life. Then a Jewish guy, Jesus, is born, amasses a bunch of followers, and though he decides or decries becoming a political leader or revolutionary. Some of his detractors sort of portrayed him that way to the Romans, and so he is executed in Roman fashion, and his followers sort of start kind of the big movement that you and I maybe have heard of as the modern Christian churches and so forth, including the Catholic Church, out of Rome itself. And the Christian sense of wealth is that it's an evil distraction. So the temptation, the moral freight of having too much money is a real problem. Like it's an existential threat, because like the Epicureans, the Christians come to believe and espouse the belief that we have a soul, and it's a lot more important than the body. Different threads or strains or flavors of Christianity over the years have placed more or less emphasis on the body, but all seem to agree that your soul's pretty important, because if it's doing pretty good, you're going to be in heaven for eternity, is the thinking. And if you're not doing so good, you're going to be in the lake of fire for eternity, or just completely separated from the presence of God, which is the two primary definitions, depending on the school of Christianity, of what hell actually is. Is it hellfire and brimstone, or is it just like a cold, dark place where there is no God for your eternal soul forever and ever? So this is a major shift over the course of not a lot of centuries. From, yeah, wealth is fine if you have a little bit. You can kind of smooth your road, your cyclical sense of time and so forth, make next year a little bit easier than last year. But here we have verses out of originally the Hebrew Bible, and then the Christian Bible is a superset of the New Testament on top of that, saying that the love of money is the root of many kinds of evil. Right? That's a pretty big statement. Whereas the Romans are like, yeah, no, money's fine. Like, enlist, make bank, retire at 35, and live it up the rest of your life, right? So, our sense of wealth is going to inform our sense of what is okay in terms of stuff like forest resource utilization for the purposes of things like recreation and leisure. All right? Pretty wild stuff. So, take a moment to reflect on where you are on this list. I presented a very, very, very aggressively simplified, some might say oversimplified, but this is a useful three-part sort of sequence for us. Where do you think about wealth on this spectrum or this sequence? Like, are you here to make bank, to stack up piles of cash, join that online movement of financial independence, retire early, abbreviated FIRE, right? Eat ramen for the next 12 years and retire a millionaire at 31, or something like that? Or are you more along the sort of ancient Greek sense of, yeah, I mean, I gotta figure out how to buy ramen, but beyond that, I'm meh. It's fine, it's ramen. So what do you think? Just out of curiosity, where do you guys see yourself on this range?
Oh, are you asking, or is that rhetorical?
I'm asking.
I guess leaning more towards like a distraction, like material things don't bring happiness in the end, I guess. I mean, I'm a philosophy minor, and I'm actually taking a Eastern philosophy class right now. And I know we're focusing on Western because that's kind of what influences American thought, but even in Eastern philosophy, you see a lot of descriptions of wealth as this sort of distraction, especially in Buddhism.
Mm-hmm.
That's one of the Four Noble Truths. And so, I don't know, I kind of agree that too much wealth doesn't lead to good things. So more towards that last definition.
How much is too much?
Well, more than you need.
Valid question. And pegging where you need, or how much you need, versus how much is really nice to have, is a big question. Yeah, it's a really big question. So, for example, here in the United States, if you make about $35,000 a year, so what, like maybe like a first-year elementary school teacher, or a lot of entry-level positions, about $35,000 a year in terms of United States American dollars in 2024. All these values are relatively shifting with inflation and trade imbalances and stuff like that. But 35 grand per year income from any source puts you in about the top 1% of global income and wealth and asset accrual. So if you guys get your forestry degrees and you head out and you're trimming trees as tree monkey arborist up in the tree, sawing off stuff with a pole saw on harness, or working wildland fire and making probably more than $35,000 a year with overtime and hazard pay, etc., then we're doing pretty well relative to other people. But part of these schools of thought is, do we set ourselves, so on a scale of 1 to 100, do we put ourselves in the 99th percentile and call that good relative to other people? Or do we say, okay, I need, let's say, $35,000 to pay rent, put gas in my tank, and put food on the table, regardless of what it costs other people to live, regardless of what it costs or how much other people make, right? So is it a relative or absolute determination? We're getting pretty high elevation on this stuff, right? But we want to think about this stuff. We want to ground truth it against what other people's lived experience is as well. So 35,000 is equivalent to 99th percentile on wealth. Okay.
I guess what I would consider too much is if your desire for the acquisition of wealth gets to the point where it's negatively impacting other people or leaving other people without the means for their own survival.
Okay.
For example, you're a big business CEO and then you outsource your company's labor to other countries so that you can get cheap child labor for your own acquisition of wealth by cutting costs, but then you're negatively impacting another person's quality of life. I would say that's when it gets to the point of, okay, that's too much wealth.
Okay. Heard. That's a very good point. Do we agree with the words written on the Statue of Liberty, a gift from France? Give me your tired, poor, huddled masses yearning to breathe free. Is our stacking up of wealth making it harder for somebody else to breathe free, so to speak? Very good point. Anybody else? Where do you see yourself on this kind of range or list or spectrum? You have a very neutral attitude towards wealth? And these are important questions. Like, what I'm really asking is, why are you here? Why are you getting a forestry degree? Are you doing it so that you get that paycheck? Are you doing it to help other people live a little easier? Are you doing it for something else? Are you doing it for the love of knowledge, like some of our Greek philosophers think is pretty cool and interesting and even important? All right, so does anybody else see yourself anywhere on this range or list? Wealth is good. Wealth is the point. Wealth is bad. Wealth is evil and dangerous to you. What do you think?
I think wealth can be good, it can be bad. Like, like he said, you shouldn't let it drive you to harm others. But so long as you can, I think that wealth is a tool that should be used.
Okay.
So that I think that you should use it.
All right. So the reason that I'm asking this question, thank you, is because your work as a forester, or in specific as a park ranger in my subdiscipline of forestry, it has everything to do with how everybody else is answering this question, right? So are we making money to not just put a roof over our heads, to have enough, to put food on the table, to not worry about how we're going to pay for a broken leg if we got to go to the ER? But is it also, I'm saving up some money to go to such and such national park? If a lot of people think that the pursuit of wealth is a tool for going to your national park or your national forest, to the Shawnee or to Crab Orchard National Wildlife Refuge, the unit of the Fish and Wildlife Service, if they think that is the highest and best use of their precious, irreplaceable, and limited time and energy and money, well then, if everybody thinks that way, you're going to have hundreds of millions of visitors. Does that make sense? Okay. So, we're going to enter fall break with that thought in mind. How everybody answers this question determines how busy you're going to be and the ways in which you're going to be busy as a forester. Sound good? All right, have a safe and fun fall break. Hiking and camping, happy birthday. I'm around for questions if you have them. Otherwise, we'll see you on Tuesday.
And what are we on Monday?
Oh, on Tuesday?
Yeah, whatever.
Yeah, we talked about basically sort of the much more ancient history component of this. So like ancient Babylon and its hanging gardens as a way to kind of civilize and demonstrate power over the wildness and unpredictability and the dangers of nature in a temple setting. It's one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world.
Yeah, I was really sick, so I decided I'd just watch some Crash Course instead.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah. Hope you're feeling better.
Yeah. Thank you. Have a good day.
You too. What's up?